It begins in the quiet, not with a sound, but with the presence of an object. A tablet of baked clay, small enough to be held in two hands, yet heavy with a density that seems to defy its size. It rests in the low, angled light of a conservation lab, or perhaps in the memory of the dust where it was found, a place where the wind has moved silently over the same contours for 4,000 years. The air itself feels ancient, filled with the fine sediment of collapsed cities and forgotten languages. There is no audience here, only the object and the observer, caught in a suspended moment where the immense distance of time feels suddenly, unnervingly thin. The journey does not start with a shout, but with the stillness that surrounds a single surviving thought, hardened into earth, and waiting for a patient eye to fall upon it once more. This is the entry point, a simple artifact that carries within its incised lines the seed of a profound contradiction. The marks etched into its surface are not poetry. They are not an epic tale of heroes or a hymn to the gods, at least not in the way we have come to understand such things. They are precise, uniform, and repetitive. They are the work of a scribe, but a scribe who functioned more as a celestial accountant, a bureaucrat of the cosmos. The wedge-shaped impressions of the cuneiform script form lists, tables, and inventories. They record the allocation of resources, the duration of rains, the functions of divine entities, and the established order of the world. There is a cold, administrative logic to the arrangement of the symbols, a dispassionate tone that suggests the author was not inventing a story, but documenting a system, a set of operational facts as real to him as the rising of the sun or the flooding of the river. He was a keeper of records, and this tablet is a single page from a vast, and now mostly lost, ledger of reality itself. This particular record, or one of its many surviving copies, is known to us as a king list. Its purpose appears straightforward: to document the succession of rulers, the transfer of power, the continuity of kingship from one generation to the next. It is a foundational document, a pillar of statehood meant to legitimize authority by anchoring it in the deep past. Yet, as the eye moves down the columns of names and numbers, a division appears. The scribe himself has drawn a line, a clear and deliberate separation within the data. The text explicitly states its own structure, dividing history into two distinct epochs. There are the kings who ruled before a great flood, and there are the kings who ruled after the flood swept over the land. This is not a footnote or an interpretation. It is a structural feature of the primary data, a division as fundamental to the record as the columns that separate names from regnal years. One must pause here before looking at the numbers themselves. The very act of this division is a statement of profound significance. For a culture so dependent on cycles, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the moon, the predictable rhythm of the rivers, what could it mean to record a singular event that irrevocably broke time in two? This is not the language of myth as we tell it, full of metaphor and allegory. This is the language of accounting. It is as if a modern financial ledger were to be split into two sections: income before the fire and income after the fire. The event is presented as a cataclysmic data wipe, a point after which the very nature of the accounting had to change. The scribe is not telling a story about a flood. He is using it as a chronological marker that separates two fundamentally different qualities of existence. In the time before the deluge, the scribe records the reigns of 8 kings across 5 cities. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is listed as having ruled for 800 years. His successor, Alalangar, ruled for 36 years. The numbers continue in this fashion, a calm recitation of impossibly vast timescales. Dumuzid, the shepherd, is said to have reigned for 36 years. Enmen-dur-Ana of Sipar, 21 years. The total for these 8 rulers, as the scribe himself calculates at the bottom of the section, is 200 years. The figures are presented without any hint of embellishment or disbelief. They are written with the same administrative sobriety as a tally of grain sacks or a census of livestock. This is not a fable about long-lived ancestors. It is an official state registry whose opening entries operate on a timescale that is utterly alien to our understanding of human life. And then the record breaks. The scribe inserts a line. After the flood swept over, and kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The narrative resumes, but the scale of reality has been violently altered. The first king of the new era, Jushur of Kish, is recorded as reigning for 200 years, still an immense span, but a drastic reduction. As the list progresses, the numbers continue to shrink, moving from the mythological to the merely heroic, and finally to the mundane and biologically plausible. Etana, the shepherd who ascended to heaven, ruled for 560 years. And Mebaragesi, a king whose existence has been archaeologically verified, reigned for 900 years. Soon after, we find rulers like Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose reign is listed at a mere 126 years. The data set has not just changed. It has snapped into a completely different order of magnitude, and the document offers no explanation for this radical shift beyond the simple, stark statement that the flood occurred. In the climate-controlled silence of a modern archive, the researcher's hand moves slowly over a high-resolution image of the tablet. The work is methodical, patient, almost ritualistic. Each symbol is cross-referenced, each potential translation weighed. The instinct of the modern mind is to dismiss the early section as pure fantasy, a preamble of myth before the real history begins. But the researcher's task is not to judge the data, but to understand it as it was recorded. They must confront the uncomfortable fact that the scribe made no distinction in tone or format between the king who ruled for 800 years and the one who ruled for 28. To the original keeper of this record, both were equally factual, both part of the same continuous, albeit fractured, timeline. The document presents itself as a single, coherent file, forcing the observer to either accept its internal logic or to impose an external one that breaks the artifact in two. The question that forms in this silence is not whether these kings actually lived for millennia. That is a question that closes inquiry. The more profound, more unsettling question is this: why would a civilization's earliest and most pragmatic record-keepers, the inventors of bureaucracy and written law, choose to begin their entire unbroken history of political power with a set of data that so completely defies reality? These were not poets lost in fanciful reverie. They were the accountants and administrators of the world's first cities, obsessed with order, measure, and the tangible realities of grain, water, and labor. Why would these minds, so grounded in the practical, meticulously record and preserve a prelude that was, by their own later standards, utterly impossible? The anomaly is not that the numbers are large, but that they exist at all, inscribed at the very foundation of organized history. This is not the product of a single, dreaming mind or an isolated artifact. This pattern, this strange memory of a different kind of time, echoes in fragments recovered from the ruins of different cities, copied and recopied by scribes across centuries. From Nippur, from Larsa, from Sipar, the same fundamental structure appears. A lost era of immense duration, populated by a handful of rulers, separated from the present by a world-altering flood. It suggests a shared foundational memory, a standard operating history for the entire Sumerian world. It is as if their civilization did not believe it was beginning from nothing, but was instead rebooting after a catastrophic system failure. The history they chose to write down was not one of creation from chaos, but of resumption after an immense and silent interruption. And so we remain here, in the quiet of this late hour, with the faint hum of the archive lights, or the whisper of a desert wind. The document has asked a question that it does not answer. It has presented a framework of the world that begins with an impossibility and treats it as a simple fact. The initial disturbance has been created, not by a claim, but by the cold, hard data of the record itself. There is a certain kind of quiet that comes with such questions, a stillness that invites not a quick answer, but a deeper, more patient form of attention. For those who have chosen to stay in this room, in this moment of contemplation, you know it well. It is the feeling that the past is not entirely past, and that some of its oldest memories are still waiting to be properly read. The examination must begin with the material itself. The clay, cool and dense in the hand of the archivist, or under the sterile light of the laboratory. The marks are not impressions of a fleeting thought. They are deliberate, uniform, pressed into the damp earth by a stylus held in a steady, practiced hand. Each wedge and line is an act of data entry. We are not reading a poem. We are auditing a database. The scribe's presence is felt not in his personality, but in its complete absence. He has effaced himself, leaving behind only the structure of the information, a clean and orderly ledger from a world that has otherwise vanished. This is the first and most critical observation. The form of the record is one of absolute administrative sobriety. It is a document designed not for inspiration, but for reference. It is a file, pulled from a cabinet that has been buried for 4,000 years, its contents still waiting for a final audit. We turn to the first entry, under the heading of the first city, Eridu, the city where kingship, as the text states, first descended from heaven. The scribe's stylus moves with a practiced economy. He records the name, Alulim. Then he moves to the next column, the one reserved for regnal duration. There is no flourish, no special emphasis. He presses the symbols for the number into the clay. 2 Shar, 8 Ner. The calculation is simple, the value unambiguous. The record states that Alulim, first king of Eridu, ruled for 800 years. The number sits there on the tablet, a piece of administrative data, as mundane in its presentation as a harvest tally or an inventory of temple sheep. The scribe offers no commentary. He simply records the figure as it was given to him, a clerk filling out a form with the information required. The process is repeated. The stylus moves down to the next line. The next ruler is named Alalangar. The scribe again moves to the column of duration. He impresses a new set of numbers. 3 Shar, 6 Ner, 36, 0 years. The entry is made with the same dispassionate precision as the first. The impossible figure is followed by another, larger, more impossible figure. This is not the work of a storyteller building a myth. A storyteller would vary the details, add color, explain the fantastic nature of his claims. The scribe does the opposite. He strips the information down to its barest components: name, city, duration. The sheer monotony of the list, its repetitive, bureaucratic structure, is what creates the deep and unsettling dissonance. It is the coldness of the presentation that makes the heat of the impossibility so palpable, a quiet but persistent fever in the heart of the archive. This consistency forces a difficult question upon the observer. If this were a simple error, a single flight of fancy, it could be dismissed as a poetic flourish. But it is not. It is a standardized data set, repeated with minor variations across multiple copies of the list found in different locations, copied by different scribes over centuries. This implies the existence of an authoritative source, a master document from which these copies were made. The scribes were not inventing these numbers, they were transcribing them. They were performing the careful, conservative work of data preservation, ensuring the continuity of a record they believed to be foundational. Their primary duty was not to interpret the information, but to transmit it without corruption. The strangeness lies not in a single scribe's imagination, but in a shared institutional memory that treated these numbers as historical fact. One can almost feel the stillness of the scriptorium where this work was done, the dry air, the scent of the clay, the rhythmic tap of the stylus. The scribe is not wrestling with the meaning of a 3600-year reign. He is focused on the technical execution of his task, the correct angle of the wedge, the proper spacing between signs, the accurate transcription of the source document before him. The number itself is abstract, a set of symbols to be copied. Its plausibility is not his concern. His concern is fidelity to the record. In this silent, focused act of transcription, the impossible is laundered into the mundane. It becomes just another entry in the long, continuous column of official history, a piece of data that has been sanctioned, recorded, and filed away for future reference. The pattern continues, a relentless march of administrative surrealism. The record moves from Eridu to the city of Bad Tibira, and then to Larak. Enmenlu-Ana is listed with a reign of 43,200 years. His successor, Enmengal-Ana, is recorded at 28,800 years. Dumuzid, the shepherd, is given 36 Eozozeran years. The geographical scope widens, but the fundamental anomaly remains locked in place. This was not the private myth of a single city-state, but a shared historical framework for the entire Sumerian world. These were the official reigns of the first kings, taught in the scribal schools, preserved in the temple archives, and accepted as the bedrock of their chronology. The document is building a case not through rhetoric but through the sheer, overwhelming weight of its own structured, internally consistent, and utterly unbelievable data. And then, as if to prove its own administrative diligence, the scribe performs a calculation. After listing the 8 kings and their 5 cities, he draws a line and provides a total. The text states plainly, 8 kings. Their reigns were 241 years. This is not a storyteller's summary. It is an accountant's subtotal. The scribe has added the column. He has checked his own work. He has looked at the vast sum and recorded it without a flicker of doubt or astonishment. This small act of arithmetic is perhaps the most unsettling detail in the entire document. It confirms that he was not mindlessly copying symbols. He was processing the data. He engaged with the numbers on their own terms, and found them internally coherent, ready to be tallied and entered into the final summary of the epic. In the quiet of the present, a researcher can perform the same calculation. With a modern calculator or a simple pencil and paper, they can add the 8 figures. The sum is, of course, 241,200. The mathematics are flawless. The ancient scribe and the modern scholar arrive at the exact same number, a bridge of pure logic spanning 4 millennia. This perfect correspondence serves only to deepen the mystery. The document cannot be dismissed as a mathematical error or a misunderstanding of the numeral system. It is a perfectly executed piece of accounting whose underlying assets, the reigns themselves, seem to belong to a completely different reality. The record is a closed loop, logical and consistent within its own boundaries, but those boundaries enclose a space that our own understanding of time cannot enter. The document then pivots, not with a narrative flourish, but with another procedural note. A single, stark line is entered into the record. After the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven a second time. Kingship was in Kish. The language is that of a logbook, an entry marking a system-wide event. The flood is not described with poetic terror. It is presented as a chronological fulcrum, a point in time that separates 2 distinct operational phases of the world. It is the ultimate discontinuity, the moment the old ledger was closed and a new one was opened. The scribe is not telling the story of the flood. He is using the flood as a filing marker, a way to partition the data into before and after. The nature of kingship, the very operating system of civilization, had to be reinstalled. For just a moment, stop listening to my voice. Listen instead to the space you are in right now, the hum of a machine, the silence of a late hour, the distant sound of the world outside. Note the exact time on the nearest clock. This simple act of observing and recording your immediate present is the same ritual the scribe performed. You are anchoring a moment in time. If you feel so moved, record that time or the silence in the comments below. It is a small gesture, but it connects your active witness to his, a quiet mark of presence in the flow of a very long story. You are not just a listener. You are now a fellow keeper of the watch, marking the passage of time as we move through these ancient files together. We must now turn our attention from the king lists to a different set of documents. We leave the clean, columnar data of the reigns and enter the more complex syntax of the cosmological texts. But the search is for the same signature, the same administrative mindset. The question is whether this cold, bureaucratic tone is an isolated feature of the king lists, or if it is the default mode of recording for the Sumerian scribe, the standard language for documenting the workings of the cosmos itself. If the king lists are the chronological ledger, then these other texts might be the operational manuals, the corporate bylaws of the universe. We are looking for a continuity of style, a sign that the same dispassionate mind that recorded the reigns also recorded the functions of the gods. What we find is immediate and startling. The language used to describe the actions of the great gods, the Anunnaki, is not the language of creation, but of administration. The texts are replete with terms that a modern reader would associate with law, commerce, or civil engineering. The gods do not create the world from a swirling chaos in a fit of divine passion. Instead, they establish domains, assign duties, decree the fates, and survey the territory. They are depicted as a council of directors, dividing a pre-existing asset, the world, into various departments and assigning managers to oversee them. One text describes how the god Enlil, using a divine instrument, draws the borders between territories. This is not the act of a creator god. It is the act of a cosmic surveyor, partitioning a land that is already there. This choice of language is a profound clue. It implies a pre-existing order, a world that was already functioning before the Anunnaki began their work of organization. You cannot assign a duty if the system of duties does not yet exist. You cannot survey and divide a territory that has not yet been formed. The entire vocabulary presupposes a set of established structures and principles that the gods are inheriting, not inventing. They emerge in the records not as primordial forces of creation, but as high-level administrators tasked with managing a complex, ongoing enterprise. Their authority seems to stem from their ability to organize and direct what is already present, to bring a new level of order and efficiency to a system that was already running. A different kind of silence falls here. It is the silence that follows the reading of a legal contract or a technical manual. The mind is not filled with wonder, but with a sense of intricate, impersonal logic. The image of the cosmos that emerges from these texts is not one of divine mystery and raw power, but of a vast, interlocking bureaucracy, a system of rules, jurisdictions, and functions that governs everything from the rising of the sun to the sprouting of a barley seed. It is a universe that runs on decrees and regulations, not on miracles. This vision is, in its own way, far more alien than a world born from mythic battles. It suggests that at the deepest level of reality, there is not chaos or magic, but a cold, crystalline, and ancient set of operating procedures. This is reinforced when we examine the names of the divine beings themselves. Many are not personal names in the modern sense, but functional titles. Enlil, one of the most powerful figures in the pantheon, can be translated as Lord of the Command or Lord of the Air. Enki, the god of wisdom and magic, is Lord of the Earth. Nana, the moon god, is simply Illuminator. These are not names, they are job descriptions. They describe the being's role and sphere of influence within the cosmic administration. It is as if the individuals are secondary to the positions they hold. The system, the organizational chart, is the primary reality, and the gods are the executives appointed to fill its various directorships, their very identities defined by the function they perform. And beneath even these high administrators, the records speak of another, more fundamental layer of order, the Abzu. The Abzu is not a god or a place in the conventional sense. It is conceptualized as the source of all knowledge, the wellspring of the cosmic laws and divine ordinances known as the Mez. It is an abstract reservoir of the fundamental principles that govern reality. Even the most powerful gods, including Enki, the Lord of the earth, do not create the Mez. They must obtain them from the Abzu. The Abzu predates them. It is an independent and ultimate authority, a kind of cosmic constitution or source code that even the gods themselves must consult and obey. They are not the authors of the law. They are its interpreters and enforcers. The scribe records this complex hierarchy with the same detached clarity he applied to the king lists. He notes which god holds which office, which domains fall under their jurisdiction, and how their authority is ultimately subject to the immutable principles of the Abzu. There is no sense of awe in his writing, only a meticulous documentation of the system as it was understood. The gods are not portrayed as omnipotent beings. They are powerful, yes, but they are also constrained. They operate within a pre-existing legal and conceptual framework. They can be promoted, demoted, or have their duties reassigned. They are executives in a cosmic corporation, bound by the bylaws of an organization they did not found, an organization whose origins are lost in an even deeper layer of silence. Reading these documents in this manner, one begins to see a coherent picture emerge, but it is not the one we were taught. The king lists provide a chronology, fractured by a great cataclysm. The cosmological texts provide the organizational chart of the new administration that took over after the reboot. Neither document claims to be a story of creation from nothing. Instead, they read like a vast, fragmented corporate archive detailing a massive restructuring event. They are the surviving files from a transfer of power, the administrative record of a new management team taking control of a very, very old enterprise. The evidence does not point to the dawn of the world, but to the dawn of a new age of administration. And this leaves us with the most unsettling question of all. What became of the old one? The dust has settled, but the question remains, hanging in the still air of the archive. The inquiry cannot rest on a single document, no matter how strange its contents. A single anomaly is a curiosity. A pattern is a signal. The work, therefore, must move outward, from the specific to the general. It begins with the pull of a drawer in a long, silent corridor of a foreign museum, or perhaps with the careful turning of a page in a decades-old excavation report. The researcher's task is to search for echoes, for other instances of this same chronological rupture. The search is not for a story, but for a data structure. It is a slow, methodical process, a patient sifting of the vast, fragmented library of a civilization that has turned to dust, looking for another copy of a file that should not exist, a record that begins where logic ends. And it is found, not once, but multiple times. In the ruins of Sippar, a cylinder is unearthed, its surface covered in the familiar, neat script. In the archives of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, a prism of baked clay waits, catalogued decades ago. From the sands that now cover what was once Larsa, another fragment emerges. Each artifact is separated from the others by miles and centuries, copied by different scribes in different eras. Yet when the translations are laid side by side, the same fundamental structure stares back from the page. There are variations, of course. A name is spelled differently, a regnal number shifts slightly, the order of the cities is altered. But these are the minor discrepancies of manual data entry over a long period. The core architecture of the information remains rigidly, impossibly consistent. A list of a few kings with immense lifespans, a world-ending flood, and then a new list of kings whose time on the throne shrinks toward the humanly recognizable. The archaeologist's work becomes one of comparison, a quiet and focused ritual performed under the low hum of a desk lamp. High-resolution photographs of the disparate fragments are aligned on a screen. Lines of code run, comparing sequences of signs, flagging similarities, mapping deviations. It is a cold, digital collation of an ancient, organic mystery. The human element is present only in the slow, deliberate movement of a hand guiding a mouse, or the faint reflection of a face on the dark screen, staring at the emerging pattern. The evidence is no longer a single aberrant file. It is a system, a standardized historical model that was distributed and maintained across the whole of the Sumerian world for more than 1,000 years. The sheer administrative effort required to maintain such a consistent, yet unbelievable, record is a fact more concrete and more challenging than the numbers themselves. This consistency is a silent testament to the mind of the scribe. His role was not to create, but to preserve. His highest virtue was not imagination, but accuracy. In his careful copying of these lists, he was participating in a tradition, ensuring the faithful transmission of what was considered foundational knowledge. He was not the author of the data, he was its custodian. The pattern that the modern researcher now sees emerging on a computer screen is a ghost image of a curriculum, a standardized text taught in the scribal schools of Nippur and Ur. It was the official, sanctioned history of the world, and its first chapter began with a series of kings who ruled for 250,000 years. This was not a fringe belief or a poetic fancy. It was the bedrock of their understanding of time, as fundamental as the division of the year into months and the day into hours. Here, a different kind of work begins. It is the work of recognition. The act of seeing a pattern is not a passive event. It is a choice to remain, to look longer, to hold the disparate pieces in the mind until they form a coherent shape. Many will see only curiosities and move on. But for those who stay, who allow the weight of the repetition to settle, the nature of the inquiry changes. It is no longer about a single strange document, but about a deep, structural memory that a civilization chose to preserve. This journey through the archives is a quiet one, and it is not for everyone. It is for those who understand that some truths do not shout, but wait patiently in the silence between the records. For those of you who have followed this far, you are part of that patient watch. You have chosen to stay in the room as the pattern comes into focus. The pattern, however, is not confined to the king lists. It is a signature that appears in other files, in other departments of the cosmic administration. The researcher pulls a new set of tablets from their digital or physical storage. These are not chronological records, but cosmological ones, the texts that describe the organization of the universe and the functions of the gods. The language shifts, but the underlying tone, the cold administrative sobriety, remains eerily familiar. The texts describe the Anunnaki not as creators in a primordial sense, but as organizers, legislators, and directors. A recurring phrase appears in multiple accounts. They decreed the fates. This is not the language of a poet describing the birth of the cosmos. It is the language of a clerk recording the minutes of a board meeting where key strategic decisions were made. This legislative language extends to the division of the world itself. The records do not speak of the gods forming the mountains and rivers from nothingness. Instead, they describe a process of surveying and allocation. One text details how Enlil, the chief of the council, drew the borders and assigned the territories. This implies a world that was already present, a landscape that existed prior to its division and assignment. The act is one of political and administrative organization, not of physical creation. The gods are behaving like a colonial power partitioning a newly acquired continent, or a corporation restructuring its departments. They are imposing a new order upon a pre-existing substrate, a world whose own origins are never mentioned, a silence that looms behind every recorded decree. The researcher traces these specific, functional terms across the entire library of cuneiform literature. The same verbs, the same administrative nouns appear again and again. They are found in hymns praising the gods, but also in legal codes defining property rights, and in contracts recording the sale of land. The Sumerians used the same vocabulary to describe the decrees of their gods and the rulings of their mortal courts. There was no separation. This suggests that for them the universe did not operate on a different set of principles than their own society. The cosmos was a state, and the gods were its government. It was all one vast interlocking bureaucracy, and the scribe was the functionary whose job it was to keep all the records in order, from the reigns of the first kings to the divine edict that fixed the course of the stars. A particular tablet, a fragment from the city of Nippur, is examined under a magnifying light. It is a list of divine functions, known as the Mes. The list is long and meticulously organized. It includes concepts fundamental to civilization: kingship, priesthood, law, truth, art, and craft. But the text does not state that the gods created these concepts. Instead, it describes how the god Enki gathers them, organizes them, and assigns them to various gods and cities. The Mes are treated as a set of technologies or operating systems that exist independently. They are a pre-existing resource that must be managed and distributed. Enki is not an inventor. He is a chief technology officer, implementing a suite of established programs to ensure the smooth functioning of the civilized world. The origin of the programs themselves remains, as always, unstated. This pattern of inheriting rather than creating is the second great structural echo that ripples through the records. The king lists remembered a transfer of power after a great flood. These cosmological texts seem to record a similar transfer of operational control. The Anunnaki are consistently portrayed as taking charge of a system that is already in motion. They establish order, yes, but it is a new order imposed upon an old one. They are reformers, perhaps even usurpers, but not creators. The researcher, sitting in the silence of the lab, begins to see the faint outline of a single, coherent narrative hidden beneath the surface of these disparate documents. It is the story of a transition, a handover of a vast and ancient enterprise, with most of the files from the previous administration either lost or deliberately erased. The third and perhaps most profound pattern emerges not from what is said, but from the very structure of their cosmic model. In text after text, there is a reference to a source of power and knowledge that seems to predate even the highest gods. It is called the Abzu. It is not a place in the sky or a god on a throne. It is described as a deep, foundational source, the wellspring of all cosmic laws, all sacred formulas, all of the essential Mes. The Abzu is the ultimate authority, an untouchable, unchangeable repository of the fundamental principles of reality. Even a god as powerful as Enki, whose temple was built over the Abzu, is not its master. He is its guardian. He goes to the Abzu to obtain the knowledge he needs, to draw from its infinite wisdom. He does not command it. He consults it. This concept is a direct contradiction to the idea of the gods as omnipotent creators. Their power is not absolute. It is contingent upon their connection to and understanding of this deeper, pre-existing source. The Abzu is the cosmic constitution, the source code that governs the entire system. The gods are the executive branch, tasked with implementing and enforcing its laws, but they cannot rewrite its fundamental articles. This introduces a third layer to the emerging picture. Not only was the physical world and its operating principles inherited, but the very laws of reality were also part of this inheritance. The Anunnaki were not the authors of the universal law. They were merely its most powerful students and practitioners. The researcher makes a note, drawing a diagram that shows the Abzu as the foundation, a silent, unmoving base upon which the entire bustling hierarchy of the gods is built. The work of the archaeologist here is akin to piecing together the fragments of a shattered mirror. Each piece reflects a part of the same lost image, but from a different angle. The first fragment, the king lists, reflects a broken timeline, a memory of two distinct ages. The second fragment, the language of the cosmological texts, reflects a process of administrative takeover, not creation. The third fragment, the concept of the Abzu, reflects a universe governed by laws that predate the governors themselves. When placed together, these fragments do not form a complete picture. Instead, they form the outline of a vast and deliberate absence. They point toward a history that is not only unwritten, but has perhaps been overwritten. The scribe recorded the details of the new administration with meticulous care, but the records of the old one are almost entirely gone. The physical act of this research is slow and painstaking. It involves hours spent in the hushed halls of museums, waiting for a particular tablet to be brought up from the vaults. It is the smell of old clay and conservation chemicals, the soft click of a camera shutter capturing a high-resolution image of a single sign. It is the patient work of translation, wrestling with a language that has been dead for 4,000 years, where a single symbol can have multiple meanings. The researcher is a detective, and the crime scene is the whole of recorded history. The victim is a lost memory. The only clues are these patterns, these faint but persistent echoes that suggest the official story is not the whole story. Each matching phrase, each repeated structure, is a small victory against the immense, crushing silence of the past. The silence itself becomes an object of study. The researcher begins to map not just what the texts say, but what they do not say. Why is there no true creation story? No account of the universe coming from nothing? Why do the records begin in media res? With a world already functioning, cities already named, and laws already in effect? The absences are as systematic as the patterns. It is as if the scribal tradition began at a specific point, with a clear mandate to document the world from that moment forward, but with an implicit instruction not to inquire too deeply into what came before. The flood serves as the perfect justification for this historical amnesia, a firewall in time that separates the current, well-documented age from a former age of which only strange, fragmented data, like the impossible reigns of the first kings, was allowed to survive. The weight of this evidence, gathered from different ruins and different archives, begins to form a coherent pressure in the mind. The initial anomaly of the king lists is no longer an isolated curiosity. It is the cornerstone of a vast, interconnected structure of belief and record-keeping. The Sumerian world, as documented by its own most diligent administrators, was not a new creation. It was a recovery, a resumption, a new order built upon the barely visible foundations of a much older one. The Anunnaki were not the architects of the building. They were the new tenants who had heavily renovated the first floor, while the deep foundations remained unseen, unmentioned, but still bearing the entire weight of the structure. The researcher leans back from the desk, the low light casting long shadows across the assembled notes and images. A feeling of profound temporal vertigo sets in. The 4,000 years that separate this moment from the time of the scribe feel suddenly insignificant. The real distance to be crossed is not this one, but the one that separates the scribe's own time from the lost epoch his records hint at. The time before the flood, the time before the decrees, the time when the Abzu was the only law. The investigation has uncovered not a secret, but a new and much deeper mystery. The question is no longer whether the king lists are true in a literal sense. The question is, what kind of world, what kind of memory, what kind of history would require a civilization to create and maintain such a record as the official starting point of its own existence? What were they trying to remember, and what were they trying to forget? The scope of the investigation has now irrevocably widened. It has moved from a single tablet to a civilization's entire intellectual framework. It has connected their history, their religion, and their understanding of law into a single, cohesive system, and that system is pointing insistently toward its own predecessor. The work done in the quiet of the archives and the dust of the field has revealed a pattern so deeply embedded that it is almost invisible, like the crystalline structure of a stone. It is a pattern of inheritance, of succession, of a new power establishing itself in the house of an old one. The next step of the inquiry must be to look for the traces of that older power, for the ghosts that might still haunt the edges of the official records, for any sign of the ones who came before. Within this vast and silent structure of cosmic law, positions must be filled. The records, in their dispassionate way, are explicit about the entities who occupied the highest offices. They are referred to collectively as the Anunnaki, a term that in its simplest translation means those of princely descent, or those who from heaven came to earth. This is not presented as a mythic name, but as a descriptor of origin and status, a designation of a class of beings defined by their provenance and their authority. They enter the record not as gods to be worshipped in a storm of emotion, but as a governing body, a board of directors whose arrival marks a new chapter in the administration of the world. Their presence is a documented fact, an entry in a logbook that predates all other histories we know. The identities of these figures are often inseparable from their duties. The name Enlil, who presided over the council, is a title, Lord of the Command. He is the executive authority, the one who issues the decrees that regulate the movements of the sky and the fates of civilizations. His counterpart, Enki, bears the title Lord of the Earth, a name that denotes not ownership in a possessive sense, but jurisdiction. He is the head of operations for the terrestrial domain, the master of engineering, knowledge, and the foundational waters of the Abzu. These are not names that inspire prayer. They are organizational titles that delineate spheres of influence. They are the names one would find on the office doors of a vast interlocking bureaucracy that governed reality itself, each director defined by the department they managed. The primary function of this body was legislative. The texts repeatedly describe the Anunnaki as gathering in an assembly, a council where the fates are decreed and the plans for the world are laid out. The language used to record these events is procedural, almost like the minutes of a meeting. Decisions are not made by a single, omnipotent will, but through deliberation, debate, and sometimes even dispute among the council members. They cast lots to divide the realms, a method of allocation that speaks not of divine whim, but of a pre-agreed-upon protocol for distributing assets and responsibilities. The universe they manage is not a new creation born of their power, but an existing territory to be zoned, regulated, and governed according to a new strategic plan. This division of labor is recorded with the precision of a legal charter. In one of the foundational texts, the world is formally partitioned. Anu, the chairman of the board, remains in the celestial domain. Enlil is given control of the air and the lands. Enki is assigned the Abzu, the deep waters, and by extension, the oversight of the earth itself. This is not a story of creation. It is an account of a major administrative restructuring. It reads like a treaty or a corporate charter, establishing clear lines of authority and operational control over different global departments. The world, it seems, was not a blank canvas, but a functioning enterprise, and these beings were the new management team, arriving to implement a new organizational structure and assert their control over its various divisions. To perceive the divine in this manner requires a fundamental shift in perspective. It asks us to set aside millennia of accumulated religious interpretation and to read the text for what it is: a record. Stripped of its later mythological gloss, it is a document that describes a system of governance. The power of these beings is not presented as metaphysical or miraculous, but as executive. It is the power to legislate, to delegate, to engineer, and to manage. The reverence they are afforded seems to stem not from their mysterious nature, but from their profound and undeniable competence. They are the ultimate authorities in a system where order, function, and the correct execution of the plan are the highest virtues. The silence of the archive seems to deepen as this realization settles. This hierarchy had multiple tiers. Below the High Council of the Anunnaki, the records speak of another class of beings, the Igigi. They are often referred to as the younger gods, a subordinate group tasked with performing the heavy labor required by the new administration. For a long period, the texts state, it was they who bore the work and suffered the toil. They dredged the rivers, dug the canals, and built the first settlements. They were the workforce, the engineering corps, the junior partners in the great enterprise. Their existence in the records reinforces the structural, hierarchical nature of this cosmic society. It was not a simple pantheon of equals, but a complex organization with a clear and demanding chain of command, complete with a labor class whose duties were heavy and explicit. The system, however, was not stable. The records describe a crisis point. The Igigi, after centuries of toil, rebelled. They set fire to their tools and surrounded the great house of Enlil, refusing to work any longer. This event is not framed as a mythic battle between good and evil, but as a labor dispute, a strike by an overworked and exhausted workforce. The response from the Anunnaki Council was not one of divine wrath, but of crisis management. They held an emergency meeting to address the uprising and find a practical solution to the labor shortage that now threatened their entire operation on Earth. The problem was logistical, and the solution they devised would be brutally pragmatic, a decision that would forever alter the course of the world. The solution, as proposed by Enki, the chief engineer, was to create a substitute. A new class of being would be fashioned, one specifically designed to bear the yoke of the gods. This is the context in which the creation of humanity is recorded. It is not a grand, poetic act of love, but a calculated technological solution to an administrative problem. The texts describe the process with a strange, almost clinical detachment, involving the mixing of clay with the blood and essence of a sacrificed god, a procedure overseen by the goddess of birth, Ninti, whose name means Lady of the Rib. Humanity enters the record as a manufactured workforce, an engineered biological asset created for the express purpose of relieving the Igigi of their toil and serving the operational needs of the Anunnaki. One must pause here. The air in the room grows still, heavy with the weight of this cold, functional narrative. The implications of such a record are not emotional in the way a myth is. They are structural. They reframe the very foundation of the human story. If this record is read as its scribe intended, as a factual account, then humanity's purpose was not to contemplate the divine, but to serve it in the most practical sense imaginable, to perform labor, to maintain the infrastructure, to be the hands that would build and maintain a world for others. The relationship described is not one of a father and his children, but of an owner and his assets, a manager and his employees. The silence that follows this thought is the silence of a deep ontological displacement. It is in this context that we must re-examine the figures of the pre-Diluvian kings. The Sumerian king list states that after the gods had established their order, kingship descended from heaven. This line, read through the administrative lens, is not a metaphor. It is a procedural statement. It describes the next phase of the project, the establishment of a local, terrestrial management structure. The Anunnaki, having secured their workforce, now appointed intermediaries, local governors to oversee the burgeoning civilization on their behalf. These first kings were not simply powerful mortals who rose to prominence. They were the first appointed managers of the terrestrial operation, their authority delegated to them from a higher, off-world source. Their function was to act as shepherds, a term used repeatedly in the texts. They were to manage the human population, to ensure the temples were maintained, the canals remained clear, and the granaries were full. They were the bridge between the Anunnaki Council and the human workers. The impossibly long reigns recorded for them, tens of thousands of years, may not be a measure of a single human life, but the duration of a specific administrative era under a particular dynasty or a particular set of directives from above. The number 28, 800 is not the age of a man. It is the duration of a project phase, a long and stable period of initial development under the direct oversight of the first governor, Alulim of Eridu, the city of Enki. This program of civilization was not left to chance. The records speak of another group of beings, the seven Apkallu, who emerged from the Abzu in the time of the first kings. They are described as wise, semi-divine figures, sometimes depicted as wearing the skins of fish. Their function was explicit. They were the instructors. They brought to humanity the foundational elements of civilization: writing, law, architecture, agriculture, and civic order. They were not gods to be worshipped, but teachers to be learned from. They were the technicians and knowledge-bearers tasked with educating the new workforce and uplifting them to a level of competence required to execute the grand plan. Their presence suggests a deliberate and structured curriculum, a systematic transfer of technology and knowledge. Thus, the entire pre-Diluvian era, as described in these administrative fragments, begins to look like a highly organized long-term colonization or development project. The Anunnaki are the executive board. The Apkallu are the technical specialists and educators. The pre-Diluvian kings are the long-serving regional directors. And humanity is the purpose-built labor force. Each group has a clearly defined role and function within a hierarchical structure. Civilization is not an organic, accidental process. It is an installation, a system implemented and overseen by a complex and multi-layered administration. The scribe is not inventing a pantheon. He is documenting an organizational chart and the project history of this vast enterprise. The presence of these others in the records, when viewed through this cold, functional lens, becomes profoundly unsettling. It is not their power that is alien, but their logic. It is the logic of a bureaucracy, of a corporation, of a state. They are rational actors, solving logistical problems, managing resources, and implementing a long-term plan. The strangeness lies in the sheer scale and nature of their project, the administration of an entire planet, and the engineering of a sentient species to serve as its workforce. The records are not a testament to their divinity, but a collection of surviving corporate files from the oldest, largest, and most mysterious enterprise in the history of the world. The researcher, surrounded by these translations, sees a coherent system emerge from the fragments. It is a world not of myth and magic, but of roles, functions, and hierarchies. The Anunnaki Council sits at the apex, decreeing the fates. The Apkallu disseminate the necessary knowledge from the Abzu. The kings govern the terrestrial settlements, ensuring the directives are followed. The human population provides the labor that sustains the entire structure. It is a perfect, top-down model of control and development, documented with the dispassionate clarity of a project manager's report. The system is logical, internally consistent, and complete. And yet, this very completeness raises the final and most crucial question of this stage of the inquiry. Every administration serves a purpose. Every project has a goal. The records are meticulous in describing the how, the structure, the hierarchy, the functions of each class of being. But they are almost entirely silent on the why. What was the ultimate objective of this immense and ancient enterprise? What resource was being harvested? What product was being manufactured? What strategic goal was being pursued on this small, watery planet? The organizational chart has been pieced together, but the company's mission statement remains missing, a final and unnerving silence at the very heart of the archive. The work now changes. It is no longer a search for patterns in what is present, but an inquiry into the patterns of what is absent. The researcher's hand hovers over a tablet fragment from the ruins of Nippur. The text is a legal code, detailing penalties for the theft of grain and the proper procedure for witness testimony. But the eye is not drawn to the neat incised lines of the script. It is drawn to the edge of the fragment, to the place where the baked clay is fractured, a ragged, ancient wound. The last line of the visible text cuts off in the middle of a word, a sentence that began 4,000 years ago and has not yet found its end. The silence that follows is no longer passive. It is an active presence in the room, a void with a distinct and measurable shape. The question is no longer what the scribe wrote, but what was written on the piece that is missing. This is the first encounter with the true antagonist of this story. It is not a being, nor a force of nature. It is the silence itself, the immense patient pressure of erasure. This fragment did not break by accident in the earth. The fracture is too clean, the loss too precise. It is one of many. The archives are filled with these broken thoughts, these interrupted decrees, an astronomical observation that lacks its conclusion, a medical text whose final prescription is lost, a king list where the succession of an entire dynasty has vanished into a chasm of missing clay. The researcher begins to catalog not the tablets, but the spaces between them. They are mapping an archipelago of surviving data in a vast, dark ocean of forgotten information. The work becomes an exercise in negative space, a study of a history that is defined more by its losses than by its survivals. The implications of this systematic fragmentation are unsettling. It suggests that the record we possess is not merely incomplete, it is a curated ruin. Someone, or something, has edited the archive with a hammer. Or perhaps the editor was simply time itself, in its slow, grinding indifference. But the consistency of the breaks, the way they often occur at pivotal moments in the text, begins to feel less like random decay and more like a deliberate redaction. The most important files have been corrupted. The key passages have been removed. We are left holding the introduction and the appendices, while the central thesis has been torn from the book. The invisible antagonist has left its fingerprints all over the crime scene, and its signature is a clean, sharp, and irreversible break in the continuity of the record. The investigation must move from the archive to the field, from the broken text to the broken earth. The archaeologist stands in the bottom of a deep trench cut into the tell of an ancient city. Above them, the history of the place is written in the walls of the earth, a library of strata. Each layer of compacted soil, ash, and debris is a chapter. The dark line of a great fire, the dense layer of a rebuilt floor, the pale band of a flood silt. The work is slow, a careful reading of the earth's own memory, scraping away the centuries 1 millimeter at a time. The air is thick with the dust of collapsed time, and the sun beats down on a silence that is measured not in hours, but in millennia. Here, too, the record is being audited, but the medium is not clay. It is the ground itself. And here, too, a profound anomaly is found. Between the layers representing a period of high civilization, dense with pottery shards, animal bones, and the foundations of large buildings, and a later, cruder period of rebuilding, there is a sterile layer. It is a band of clean, wind-blown sand, sometimes several feet thick. It contains no artifacts, no signs of life, no charcoal from cooking fires, no discarded tools. It is a blank page in the book of the earth. For a period of time, which can be measured in generations, this place was simply empty. The city was not just abandoned, it was scoured from the landscape, its memory buried under a shroud of sterile sand before a new, and often less sophisticated, culture began to build on top of its grave. This is not a gap in the record. It is a record of a gap. This sterile stratum is a physical manifestation of the same silence found in the broken tablets. It is a great, silent interruption in the life of a city, a period of profound and total absence. The archaeologist touches the boundary, the clean line where the rich, dark earth of a civilization ends and the pale, empty sand begins. It is a geological unconformity that is also a historical one. What could cause such a thing? A plague? A famine? A change in the climate that drove the people away? Perhaps, but the sheer completeness of the erasure, the way the site seems to have been wiped clean before being resettled, suggests something more than a gradual decline. It feels like a deliberate reset, a command to clear the board so that a new game could be played. The antagonist has left its mark not just on the words, but on the world itself. Back in the archives, the data is collated. The excavation reports from Eridu, from Shurapak, from Uruk, are laid out side by side. The pattern becomes undeniable. This sterile layer, this great interruption, appears at multiple sites across the Mesopotamian plain. It is not a local event. It is a regional one. A silent, empty chapter that appears in the history of almost every major city that existed before a certain point in time. The broken tablets and the empty earth are beginning to tell the same story. It is a story not of linear progress, but of a profound and violent discontinuity. A whole iteration of civilization seems to have been terminated, its records shattered, its cities buried, its memory almost entirely erased, leaving behind only these strange, silent scars, in the text and in the land. There is a particular quality to the silence that fills a room when a pattern of this magnitude becomes visible. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, resonant one, filled with the weight of a question that has been waiting for millennia to be asked again. The hum of the computer fans, the faint rustle of paper, the distant sound of traffic, all of it fades away, and what is left is the vast, deep quiet of the gap itself. The mind tries to bridge it, to imagine the world that existed before the break, but it cannot. The erasure has been too successful. All we can do is stand on the edge of this immense absence and bear witness to its size, to acknowledge its presence as the central defining feature of the history we thought we knew. For a moment, stay in this quiet. Wherever you are, simply stop and listen. Notice the intervals between the sounds, the pause between breaths, the space between the tick and the tock of a clock, the moment of stillness when one thought ends and the next has not yet begun. This is the raw material of the invisible antagonist. This is the silence we are excavating. If you feel so inclined, make a simple note of that moment. A comment below, recording the time or the nature of the silence you just observed. It is a small act, a ritual of awareness. It is a way of saying that you too are now listening not just to the story, but to the deep and resonant silence in which it is being told. You are marking the gap. The investigation now turns inward, from the physical gaps to the conceptual ones. The records of the Anunnaki administration, for all their meticulous detail, possess a central and unnerving void. They are a vast and complex operational manual, detailing the how of the cosmic system with breathtaking precision. They list the functions of each deity, the jurisdictions of each celestial body, the protocols for temple rituals, the regulations for the agricultural cycle. The entire civilized world is presented as a smoothly running machine, with every gear and lever documented, every process flow-charted. The scribe has left us the complete technical specifications for a system of planetary management. We have the schematics, the organizational chart, and the procedural handbooks. But what is entirely, deafeningly absent from these thousands of surviving texts is the why. What was the purpose of this immense enterprise? An administration of this complexity, a workforce of this scale, an intervention in planetary affairs this profound, does not exist for its own sake. Corporations have a business model. Governments have a strategic objective. But the Sumerian records, for all their bureaucratic candor, are completely silent on the ultimate goal of the Anunnaki. They never state what resource was being extracted, what product was being created, or what final outcome was being pursued. The company's mission statement is the one file that is missing from the entire archive. This silence feels different from the others. A broken tablet or a sterile layer of earth could be the result of time or a natural catastrophe. But a conceptual silence of this magnitude, at the very heart of a civilization's worldview, feels deliberate. It feels like a secret. It is as if the scribes were documenting a system whose ultimate purpose was either so self-evident to them that it required no mention, or so secret that it was forbidden to be written down. The entire vast edifice of their cosmology is a machine whose function is unknown. We can study its parts, admire its complexity, and trace its operations, but we have no idea what it was built to do. The silence here is not an absence of data. It is an absence of meaning. This leads to the final and deepest layer of silence. The records do not just lack a purpose, they lack a true beginning. As we have seen, the cosmological texts begin in media res. The world is already present. The concepts of time and space are already functioning. The cosmic laws of the Abzu are already in effect. The Anunnaki arrive on a stage that has already been set, to manage a play that is already in progress. The Sumerian scribe, the inventor of recorded history, has left us no record of what came before history itself. There is no story of a creation from nothing, no account of a primordial chaos being shaped into order for the very first time. The first page of the archive is missing, and it seems to have been missing from the very beginning. The researcher picks up a replica of a foundation tablet, the kind that would be buried beneath a temple. Its text begins not with a story of creation, but with a declaration of ownership and a list of established protocols. The first recorded words of this civilization are not words of wonder, but words of administration. They are the words of a new manager taking inventory of an old property. The silence that precedes that first cuneiform sign is the ultimate void in the record. It is the great, unwritten preamble to all of known history. The time of the predecessors, the age of the builders of the original system, is a perfect and total blank. The Anunnaki administration did not just build on top of it. Their very existence in the record seems to have overwritten it, leaving behind only the faintest of ghosts. These ghosts are the anomalies that began our inquiry, the impossible reigns of the pre-Diluvian kings. They are the only data that seems to have survived the great system reboot, a corrupted file from the previous age that was copied, perhaps without full understanding, into the new one. They are a numerical echo from a time with a different clock, a different measure of reality. They are the only direct evidence that the silence was not always silent, that the blank page was once filled with a history of its own. The scribe who recorded them was not a fantasist. He was the last archivist of a forgotten world, preserving a single strange data point from an age that had been otherwise completely and systematically erased from memory. The work of the historian, the archaeologist, the quiet observer in the late hours of the night must now confront this totality of absence. The broken tablet, the sterile earth, the missing purpose, and the absent beginning are not separate mysteries. They are four facets of a single immense event. They are the distributed evidence of a great forgetting, a deliberate or catastrophic severing of a timeline. The invisible antagonist is not just time or decay. It is the presence of a fundamental discontinuity in the memory of the world. A firewall has been erected in the deep past, and our entire history is the story of what has grown on this side of it, in the shadow of a vast and silent ruin. One does not defeat such an antagonist. One does not solve such a silence. The only possible response is to acknowledge it, to map its contours, to respect its weight. The work is not to fill the gap with speculation, but to understand the gap itself as a form of information. The erasure is the event. The silence is the signal. It tells us that the story we have is not the whole story. It tells us that our civilization is not the first draft, but a later edition, heavily edited, with the entire first volume missing. The past is not a continuous line stretching back into the mist. It is a series of islands, separated by these deep, dark, and silent channels of forgotten time. The investigation has reached a turning point. It is no longer about deciphering the words that were written. It is about learning to read the spaces between them. The true record is not the black ink of the cuneiform, but the pale, silent clay on which it rests. The mystery is not contained within the text. The text is contained within a much larger mystery. The silence is not an obstacle to the truth. The silence is the truth. It is a presence, not an absence. It is the final and most eloquent witness to a history that was so profound, so important, or perhaps so terrible, that it had to be not just forgotten, but made to seem as if it had never existed at all. The threads now begin to draw together. In the low light of this late hour, the disparate pieces of evidence cease to be isolated artifacts and begin to form the outlines of a single, coherent shadow. We have the administrative record of the pre-Diluvian kings, a data set from a different order of time. We have the legislative language of the Anunnaki, the vocabulary of a board of directors, not a pantheon of creators. We have the concept of the Abzu, a source of cosmic law that predates the lawmakers themselves. And finally, we have the silence, the broken tablets, the sterile layers of earth, the missing purpose at the heart of the entire cosmic enterprise. These are not four separate mysteries. They are the four cornerstones of a single, vast, and unacknowledged structure, a foundation buried so deep that we have mistaken it for the bedrock of reality itself. When these threads are held together, the pattern they weave is not one of creation, but of succession. The evidence, read in its own cold and procedural language, does not describe the birth of a world from nothingness. It meticulously documents a transfer of power, a change in administration. The Anunnaki do not arrive in a void. They arrive in a world that is already operating, with its territories already named and its fundamental laws already in effect. They are not the authors of the system. They are its new managers. Their great work was not one of creation, but of reorganization, of imposing a new order upon an old one. The entire Sumerian cosmology, which we have long considered a foundational myth, begins to look more like the record of a profound and far-reaching corporate restructuring, with the Anunnaki as the new executive team. This implication shifts the ground beneath our entire understanding of the past. If the gods of our first civilization were not gods in the creative sense, but inheritors of a pre-existing domain, then their power was not primordial. It was derived. Their authority stemmed not from having built the house, but from holding the keys to it. This reframes every hymn, every decree, every temple built in their name. It suggests that the reverence they commanded was based on their role as the administrators of a system far older and perhaps far greater than themselves. They were the intermediaries, the governors, the most powerful beings within a structure whose origins were already lost to the mists of an even deeper antiquity, an antiquity that their own arrival seems to have definitively closed. The silence, then, is not a simple absence of information caused by the decay of time. It is the shadow cast by this preceding world. The Great Flood, recorded by the scribe as a clean break in the timeline, becomes more than a natural disaster. It is a firewall, a cataclysmic event that severed the new age from the old. The erasure of the previous administration's files was almost total. What survived were only fragments, corrupted data like the impossible reigns of the first kings, numerical ghosts from a forgotten operating system. The systematic nature of this forgetting, the sheer completeness of the silence that covers the pre-Anunnaki world, begins to feel less like an accident of history and more like a matter of policy. A deliberate and successful effort to make the new administration seem like the only one that had ever existed. We are forced to confront a disquieting possibility. Our history does not begin where we think it does. The rise of Sumer, the invention of writing, the building of the first cities, these may not be the first chapter of the human story. They may be the first chapter of this version of the story, the first chapter after a great and terrible editor removed all that came before. If this is true, then human civilization is not a linear progression from a primitive state to a complex one. It is perhaps a recovery, a slow, difficult climb back from a civilizational collapse so profound that its memory was almost entirely obliterated, surviving only in the coded language of myth and the inexplicable data of these ancient administrative texts. The scale of this implication expands beyond the Mesopotamian plain. This is not merely a question of reinterpreting the history of Sumer. It is a question about the fundamental nature of history itself. If the foundational civilization of the West began not with a creation, but with a reboot, what does that suggest about the blueprint of our world? It proposes that we are living within an inherited structure, a house that we did not build, run according to a set of rules that we did not write. The very systems that govern our world, our concepts of law, of kingship, of cosmic order, may not be our own inventions, but faint, distorted echoes of a pre-existing model, a technology of civilization that was handed down to us after its original context and purpose had been stripped away. The mind recoils from such a thought. It is easier to dismiss the records as poetry, as the fanciful dreams of a primitive people. It is more comfortable to believe in the steady, unbroken ascent of humanity from the cave to the cosmos. But the scribe's hand was steady. His language was not that of a poet, but of an accountant. He recorded what he was taught, and what he was taught was the history of a transition between two world ages. To ignore the cold precision of his work is to choose comfort over evidence. The path of inquiry demands that we sit with the discomfort, that we entertain the possibility that the document is exactly what it appears to be, a sober, factual record of a world whose history is far older and far stranger than our own. Consider the physical reality of our planet, the deep, silent oceans, the vast, unexplored deserts, the layers of ice in Antarctica that hold a frozen record of the Earth's climate stretching back for hundreds of thousands of years. We inhabit the thin, fragile surface of a world whose own deep history is a mystery to us. Is it so difficult to believe that the history of civilization might have a similar structure? A thin, well-documented surface layer resting upon deep, silent, and forgotten strata of previous attempts, previous cycles, previous worlds built by hands we can no longer even imagine. The sterile layer of sand in the earth of Sumer is a physical testament to this possibility, a record of a time when the surface was wiped clean. This is not a search for a hidden truth that will provide a final, satisfying answer. It is the opposite. It is the slow, dawning realization that the most fundamental questions have not even been asked, because we have been reading the map upside down. We have been searching for the beginning of the story, when we should have been looking for the evidence of the story that came before it. The true history of our world may not be a tale of heroic invention, but a long, quiet detective story, a patient search for clues to the nature of a preceding reality whose existence has been almost perfectly concealed, a crime scene where the body has been missing for so long that we have forgotten a crime was ever committed. The air in this conceptual space is thin. We are at a great height, looking down upon the entire landscape of known history. From here, the familiar peaks and valleys resolve into a new and unfamiliar pattern. The rise and fall of empires, the great leaps of technology, the slow march of progress, all of it appears as a secondary process, a series of events taking place within a much larger and more ancient arena. We are not the first actors on this stage. The set was built long before we arrived, and the echoes of a previous play can still be heard in the silence between our own lines if we have the courage to listen for them. The Anunnaki were perhaps just the first of the new cast to take the stage after the old one had been violently cleared. This journey through the archives has brought us to the edge of a precipice. Below us lies not an answer, but a question of such magnitude that it threatens to consume all other questions. It is the question of our own context. Are we the authors of our own story, or are we characters within a story whose beginning and purpose are unknown to us? The evidence does not provide a definitive answer. It cannot, but it relentlessly points in one direction. It suggests that human history is a fragment, a single surviving volume from a library that has been burned to the ground. We are a species with amnesia, living in the ruins of a forgotten past, mistaking the rubble for a foundation. This is the point where the path forward becomes a matter of personal choice. To proceed from here is to accept that some knowledge does not bring comfort, but a profound and permanent sense of displacement. It is to commit to a watch that may have no end, to listen for a signal that may never become clear. For those who feel the weight of this implication, the journey does not end with a conclusion. It continues in the quiet attention you bring to the world. Your continued presence, your decision to remain in this silent inquiry, is the only signal needed. It affirms that we are not alone in this vigil, that there are others who feel the pull of this deep, historical current, and are willing to follow it, wherever it may lead. The final implication, then, is not about the past, but about the present. If we are living inside an inherited system, a great and ancient machine whose purpose is unknown, then we are all, in a sense, its unwitting operators. The structures of power, the cycles of conflict, the deep-seated impulse to build and to control, are these our own? Or are they the echoes of a programming installed in our species at its very inception, for a purpose we have long since forgotten? The crisis of the Igigi, the labor dispute that led to our creation, suggests that the original purpose was work. Are we still performing that work, blindly serving the needs of a long-departed administration, driven by an imperative whose source is no longer visible? We are left staring at the ghost of a possibility. The possibility that the others were not the start of the chain of command, but merely a single link. They were themselves subject to a higher authority, operating within a framework they did not create. The Abzu, that deep well of cosmic law, was not their invention. They were its guardians and interpreters, but not its authors. This pushes the mystery back one final, insurmountable step. If the Anunnaki were the inheritors, who were the predecessors? Who were the original architects of the system? Who wrote the laws of the Abzu? The records provide no names, no descriptions, no history. They provide only a perfect, absolute, and impenetrable silence. This is the final shape of the mystery. It is not a riddle to be solved, but a condition to be understood. We are a civilization built upon a silent abyss. Our deepest roots are not in the soil of our own history, but in the void of a history that has been erased. The impossible numbers in the Sumerian king list are not a fantasy. They are a beacon, a single point of light from a world that has otherwise gone dark. They are a message in a bottle that has washed ashore after an impossibly long journey across an ocean of time. A final, faint reminder that we were not the first, and that the story of this world is far grander, and perhaps far more tragic, than we have ever allowed ourselves to imagine. The investigation does not end here. It dissolves. It merges with a much larger and more permanent state of inquiry. The question has now become a part of the quiet background hum of the world. It is present in the static between radio stations, in the deep silence of a clear night sky, in the gaze of an animal that seems to see something that is not there. The initial disturbance, the small anomaly on a clay tablet, has expanded to encompass the entire horizon of what it means to be human. It has led us not to an answer, but to the threshold of a silence that is older than writing, older than cities, older than the gods themselves. We are left alone with the evidence, in the quiet of the archive, to contemplate the scale of what has been forgotten. The lights in the great hall are dimmed. The day's visitors are long gone, and the silence that fills the space is of a different quality now, heavier and more ancient than the quiet of an empty room. It is the silence of the objects themselves, a collective stillness emanating from sealed cases and shadowed pedestals. The low, persistent hum of the climate control is the only sound, a mechanical breath preserving the fragile survivors of a world that has turned to dust. The inquiry that began with a single disturbing number on a piece of baked clay does not end here with a conclusion. It simply returns to the silence from which it was born, a silence now resonant with the weight of a much larger and more profound question, a question that has followed us all the way back to this quiet, final room. Before us, resting on a small, dark plinth, is the object. A tablet of Sumerian clay, no larger than a human hand. In the focused beam of a single display light, its surface is a miniature landscape of ridges and valleys, the sharp, deliberate impressions of a stylus that has been still for 4,000 years. It is cool to the eye, dense, its color the pale tan of the desert from which it was unearthed. It is no longer just a piece of evidence, a file to be audited. It has become a survivor. A small, hardened piece of a single afternoon's work, a fragment of a scribe's attention that has somehow outlasted his city, his language, his gods, and the very memory of his world. It has completed its journey. Ours is to now sit with it, here in the long and quiet watch of the night. The journey we have taken in its company has not been a line, but a spiral, circling ever deeper around a central, silent void. We have moved through the cold data of the king lists, the legislative language of the cosmic decrees, and the vast, unsettling architecture of the absences themselves. To look this long and this deeply into the past is to risk a kind of temporal vertigo, a sense that the ground of the present is not as solid as it seems. The comfortable distance of history collapses, and for a moment, the immense, silent pressure of what has been forgotten feels like a physical weight in the air. We are not looking at the past. We are standing within its shadow, a shadow cast by a light whose source is no longer visible to us. One can almost feel the presence of the scribe, a ghost in the machine of history. He did not see himself as an author of myth. He was a functionary, a keeper of records, performing his duties with the dispassionate precision that his office required. His task was not to invent, but to transmit, to copy the old lists, to record the new decrees, to ensure the continuity of the archive. The impossibilities he wrote down were not his own. They were the sanctioned data of his time. In his careful, steady hand, he was not creating a puzzle for a distant future to solve. He was simply doing his job, documenting the operating system of his reality, unaware that he was also preserving the faint, spectral evidence of the one that came before it. From the sterile quiet of this room, the mind travels outward, back to the source, to the wind-scoured plains of modern Iraq, where the eroded mounds of Uruk and Eridu sleep under a blanket of dust and stars. The twilight settles over the landscape, softening the harsh lines of the broken earth, and the immense, empty silence of the desert descends. This is the other half of the record. The tiny, precise marks on the clay tablet in the museum, and the vast, silent, and empty landscape from which it was taken. The microscopic detail and the cosmological scale, both telling the same story of a grand and eloquent ruin. The words of the scribe and the silence of the land are two parts of a single, fragmented sentence. The stars emerge, cold and brilliant in the dry desert air. They are the same stars, the same patterns that wheeled over the head of the scribe in his courtyard, over the builders of the first ziggurats, over the council of the Anunnaki, as they decreed the fates. This celestial clock, indifferent and eternal, is the only true unbroken thread. It is the ultimate archive, the one record that cannot be shattered or erased. Every other history is a footnote to its silent, cyclical passage. Perhaps the strange timescales of the first kings were not measured by the sun, but by a much slower and grander celestial cycle, a rhythm of the cosmos that we have long since forgotten how to read. The sky holds the memory, even if we have lost the key. And so the question that began this inquiry returns, but it has changed its shape. It is no longer the simple, incredulous question of whether a king could live for 30,000 years. That was the door, not the room. The question now is one of context. What kind of world, what kind of history, what kind of memory would require such a record? What was the nature of the time that was being measured? The anomaly of the numbers is not the mystery. The mystery is the system, the world, the reality that created and sustained those numbers as a simple administrative fact. We are no longer questioning the data. We are questioning the very framework of the past we thought we knew. This is what remains when the text ends, a profound and unsettling education in the nature of forgetting. We think of memory as a personal, internal act, but here we have witnessed it on a civilizational scale. We have seen the evidence of a great and systematic erasure, a severing of a timeline so complete that it was almost perfect. The silence we have been excavating is not an empty space. It is the scar tissue of a deep, historical trauma. It is the final testament to the fact that what is forgotten can be a force more powerful and more defining than what is remembered. The history of our world is written as much in its silent gaps as in its surviving words. The work of the curator, the guide, is now done. The path has been illuminated. The files have been laid open upon the table. From this point forward, the watch is a solitary one. The responsibility for the question now passes from the voice in the darkness to the silent observer who has chosen to remain. To carry the weight of this unresolved inquiry is to participate in the act of remembrance itself. It is to hold a space for a history that has no other monument, to stand as a quiet witness to an absence that is almost too vast to comprehend. The story does not belong to the narrator. It belongs to the silence, and to those who are willing to listen to it. The darkness in the desert is now absolute. The silhouettes of the ancient tells have merged with the land, indistinct shapes under a river of stars. The wind moves through the broken walls of a temple that has not heard a prayer in 4 millennia, a low, sighing sound that is the only voice left to this landscape. The world of Sumer is not just gone. It has been unmade, returned to the elements of dust and silence from which it was raised. All that we have are these faint echoes, these numerical ghosts, these fragmentary reports from a long-lost administration. We are standing on the shoreline of a vanished ocean, holding a single, strange shell, trying to imagine the shape of the waters that left it behind. And so we pull back, leaving the desert to its immense and patient quiet. We recede from the archives, from the silent halls of the museum. The journey is complete, but the destination was not an answer. It was the question itself, now seen in its true and staggering proportions. The story has not been a line leading to a conclusion, but an opening, a widening of a conceptual aperture. It has left us not with a new truth, but with a new and permanent uncertainty, a quiet but persistent hum of doubt beneath the familiar narrative of our own origins. The inquiry has not ended. It has merely been properly framed. It has found its true and final scale. We are a species obsessed with beginnings. We search for the first word, the first fire, the first king. But the evidence we have examined tonight suggests a different and more unsettling possibility. What if our beginning is not a beginning at all? What if it is a resumption, a recovery, a new growth that has taken root in the ruins of a much older and far more sophisticated structure? Our history may not be the story of a slow climb from a primitive dawn, but the story of a species with a profound and traumatic amnesia, slowly rediscovering the fragments of a knowledge that it once possessed in its entirety. We may not be the architects, but the inheritors, living in a house whose blueprints have been lost for ages. And so we are left here, in the final moments, with the image of the object itself, the small tablet of clay, resting in the half-light. It has spoken its piece. It has presented its cold, clear, and impossible data. It has borne witness to its own time and to the edge of the silence that came before it. Now it returns to its own nature, which is to be a silent, patient thing. It does not demand belief. It does not offer explanation. It simply is. It endures. A single, surviving thought from a world that is otherwise a ghost. A quiet and persistent anomaly in the long official story of the world. It holds its silence. and waits. The light on the tablet softens, then fades, until the object is once more just a shape in the darkness. The low hum of the room seems to fade with it, leaving a final, profound, and unbroken quiet. The story is over. The text has ended, but the memory has been disturbed, and the question remains, hanging in the still air of the room long after the screen has gone dark. It is a question that now belongs to the silence and to you.